pages. A lot of them are quite just interested in banging something together. We'd get this sort of silly thing with lots of animated GIFs and graphics, and some very quite messy code if you examined what the HTML was behind some of these pages. And this led to a bit of a mess. And of course, we're all familiar with the various issue that web pages are displayed quite differently depending on which browser you're viewing them on. Some people thought that maybe it'd be quite a good idea if we set about actually organizing some of these web pages a bit better, and let's be a bit stricter about how some of this works. And then maybe if we are a bit stricter on how web pages are actually put together, then it might also open up some other possibilities, so perhaps some other applications or programs, in particular search engines and stuff, actually crawling them better and being able to understand the content better. They maybe got a little bit carried away, because what people actually wanted to do was put together web pages quite quickly and bang animated graphics upon them. So the W3C at one point, they said, okay, we're going to stop with this HTML and this slightly messy sort of fluid way of doing things, and we're going to get really quite strict. And they had an almighty war which may have looked a little bit like this when it occurred. Unfortunately, the result of this was that people just wanted to bang their web pages together quite quickly, and that's exactly what they did. And of course, we end up with a load of pages. It's estimated that something like 99.9% of web pages are theoretically broken from a syntax and sort of standards point of view. So then what happened about this is that there was a group originally led by Opera, and they started looking at the sort of technologies in the areas that they believe people would need in order to create the next sort of generation of web applications. They were later joined by a number of other companies, including Apple. And they put together this proposal, and they initially went to the W3C and they said, hey, we've got this idea here. Let's actually take a look at implementing some of these technologies, and we think we should actually look at how pages are being designed at the moment and make a sort of very much an easier transition path for our users. W3C, they initially rejected this proposal. They continued with their XML based route. But then, as we saw, XHTML, it probably didn't get the uptake that they may have hoped. A lot of sites are written in XHTML. And you could say in many ways it does encourage some quite good practices. It encourages some clean markup, people to pay attention to what they're actually putting on the page. But it really didn't take off in quite the way that the W3C may have wanted. So they initially said, well, let's go back to this other group here, formed of Opera, Mozilla, and friends. And we actually want to use what you guys have created as the basis for our new specification of HTML5. And that's exactly what happened. One of the confusing things about HTML5 is there's actually two versions of the specification. There's a guy called Ian Hitchinson who works for Google. He is the editor of both of them. And you say, well, how can we have two versions of this specification? This kind of thing's a bit crazy. I agree with you there. It does seem a little bit silly. But my understanding of it is you get very much the new technologies on the, there's a group called the WhatWG, and you'll get the new sort of experimental type features in this specification, and you'll get the more solid type of stuff in the W3C's version. However, they do have the same editor, so it's a little bit strange. So we can argue that HTML5 officially started in about 2004. So from the very beginning, HTML5, it was stressed that it would have to be backwards compatible. Practical usage was important. One of the things about XHTML was it was perhaps a bit academic and theoretical because it didn't actually match the sort of things that people actually wanted to do when they were creating and writing these pages. It stressed separating presentation from markup, and we'll see that in some of the items and elements that have actually been removed and dropped. One of the things, and it must have been a very hard piece of work, is that the designers of HTML5, they actually went through and documented how browsers parse and process the page and how they should actually handle various error situations. So for example, what should happen if a tag isn't actually closed, if someone leaves off a quotation mark, that type of thing. And you'll find probably about 2/3 of the HTML5 specification is actually around this type of thing, and in handling sort of invalid conditions and errors around this. They said we're going to write this in both HTML and XML syntax, and we're very much going to recognize that scripting, in particular JavaScript, is here to stay. and I think we can see that, and we've seen that recognised at Microsoft. I think some of you probably seen some of the announcements around Windows 8, and JavaScript's not going away anytime soon, no matter how much some of you guys may want it to. There's a couple of things that have been taken out of HTML5. They're mainly surrounding presentation, so this is probably not the sort of thing you should be doing anyway in your markup. This type of thing is very much better addressed within CSS. So these are now obsolete elements that you really shouldn't be using. So please don't. So what's actually new? Well, let's start diving into some stuff here. We're going to be taking a very sort of shallow overview of the majority of features in HTML5. So what I'm planning on covering with you guys is changes to the doc type, to syntax. There's a couple of new DOM methods I just want to point out. We'll look at some of the semantic enhancements, and that's about actually giving meaning to your web pages. We'll look at some of the changes to forms and how it's making it easier for users to actually enter details. We'll look at audio and video. Canvas is probably one of the things that really gets pushed with HTML5, and I think a lot of people consider HTML5 is just about Canvas. We're going to look at offline storage, and then we're also going to cover a couple of items that people think are HTML5 but aren't. And we're actually going to drill into some of those there. So, just when my laptop wakes up. So let's go into the syntax first of all. So we have this concept of doc type, whose purpose is to trigger something called standards mode in browser that basically says, I know what I'm doing with this web page, you should render it in a certain type of way. And with previous versions of these doc types, they're really quite long and lengthy. So we have this nice new short doc type with HTML5, which I think we can all remember that type of thing. And I certainly couldn't remember previous doc types. A couple of changes to syntax I want to highlight. There's no need to self-close some of these tags like image and stuff. You don't need to wrap some of these items with quotation marks, and it's case insensitive. That's not to say that you don't want to actually do some of these things. I think you probably do want to come up with some standards and how to actually write your page. It's going to make it very much easier for other people maintaining and working with it. I want to just briefly veer off about why these doc types are so important. So I'm running IE9 here. I'm just going to dive into a different demo just in order to demonstrate why this is so important here. Oh, I see my USB dongle has helpfully reset my home page. Great work. Whoa. I told you about that volume. Is that down now? Excellent. So let's go, sorry about that. Probably taken a few people out there. So let's look at this standards here and why they're actually important here. So this is a demo here. I'm using a bit of CSS3 to create like a rounded corners box here. And I'm using something called a WAF font here. So it's one of the non-standard fonts, and I can actually specify it in my HTML what to use. So if I zoom into that there, I've specified which font I want to be using here, and then on a browser that can cope with this type of thing, it will display that nice sort of new text effect there. If I bring up the developer tools here, I'm just pressing F12 to do that, I can control the mode that the browser is actually operating in. So if I go move this to browser mode 7, and we render this, we actually lose some of this functionality here. And this is the type of thing that will happen if you don't specify the doc type for your page. Particularly in Internet Explorer, it thinks, hey, I need to run using an older version of the rendering engine here. And that older version doesn't understand some of the newer things, like some of the CSS3 transforms, WAF fonts and stuff like that. So please specify, your doc type. So let's close that down and go into the semantic stuff here. So there's been a number of new elements added to HTML5, which are around adding meaning to your page. One of the things that was done by Ian Hitchinson is he took Google's index and he said, let's actually analyze all of people's pages and let's work out what the most popular sort of class names people are using within their HTML in order to work out what type of elements and we should maybe representing in our page to add meaning to them. So one We don't actually have the results of Ian's research, but some of the guys from Opera actually published some of their own, and I think we can maybe hope that it'll be somewhat similar here. So with Opera, this is what they published, and some of the most popular class names on web page HTML. I think we can see here that there's obviously quite a lot of web pages developed in MS Word. We get MSO Normal, the very descriptive Style 1, Style 2. But if we ignore some of these items from perhaps some of our more lazy colleagues, we can see that there are a couple of things that might be useful here. So perhaps the footer element here and header. These are sort of things that occur in the majority of web pages. You're very likely going to have a header, a footer section. Similar story with some of the ID stuff here. And so what actually happened is they used the results of some of this research here. Go away, little magnifying glass. And they've actually come up with a whole heap of new elements in order to give meaning and describe stuff on your page. So we have the header element, which surprisingly enough, it's for introductory or navigational aids. We have the nav element for representing navigation. Aside, which is about content, which is slightly separate. We have the footer. I think these are fairly self-descriptive here. You can have a look in the specification yourself. There's quite sort of lengthy description about when you should be using these various elements. And I think we can all agree it's a bit subjective as well. But please refer to the specification about more details of some of these. All of these can actually be nested. So for example, in the header, you could have a navigation element. There's a couple of other elements that I've actually left off here. There's one called H-group, which is about grouping header level elements. This one seems to pop in and out of the specification. So at the moment it's part of the specification, but as of May it wasn't. So keep an eye on that particular one, and you might want to avoid that type of thing. So I'm going to take an example of a page. Normally with my demos I quite like to come up with quite silly examples. In this particular case I didn't have to, as the Age provided me a nice story of a drunken fight that took place with a swordfish skeleton. So if we take this page here and actually think about how we might want to divide this up with our new elements here. So perhaps this top section here, this is a header element. Perhaps we take this sort of links at the top here, we make that into navigation. More than navigation there, we can nest some of these. We could join maybe this as a section, another section here. Now, I think section's kind of a horrible type of element in some ways, in that it doesn't actually really give very much more meaning than if you stuck a div on the page. And I think there's a couple of other people that are really sort of starting to consider this point as well. There's a guy called John Alsop, who some of you are familiar with, and he writes quite a lot on this about how some of these elements, they're really not giving you a lot of additional information. There's another way of describing the purpose of various elements on a page called ARIA. Basically, you have something called ARIA roles, which is another attribute that's added to them. And this is particularly important for some of your disabled users. As you can say, this control here is a slider, and some of the screen readers and devices can actually interpret some of this. And it's probably mainly for some of your disabled users that this is going to be initially important. Although my understanding is that currently some of the screen readers don't support these type of elements, but hopefully they will do in the future. These sort of adverts on the side, they're not part of the main content. Maybe we use the aside element to represent these particular elements here. Another advert over there. And you can see how you can divide your page and perhaps give it a bit more detail. Maybe use an H1, maybe use a header, who knows. However, there's some issues with some of these semantic elements here. The main issue is within previous versions of Internet Explorer. I know that's going to surprise some of you here. So just to show you what this particular issue is, I'm going to bring up Internet Explorer, go away, big pond, and I'm going to go into my demo, and I'm going to index here. One of the great things about the sort of latest version of Internet Explorer is that we can actually demonstrate, as I did, the different rendering modes and how previous versions are actually going to behave. So I'm just going to go into Semantic here. Currently it's using the IE9 version of rendering engine. The IE9 engine understands some of these new elements. however previous versions of Internet Explorer don't. So if I go and change this to Internet Explorer 7, and let's just jump into the HTML on this page here. I've added just a very simple bit of CSS there that's just going to make the background yellow and increase the size of the font there. I've got my section here. I should be styled sad face down there, because in previous versions of Internet Explorer 8 and below, it won't be. Certain older versions of Firefox and Gecko-based browsers, they do some even more odd things. Instead of not actually styling content, they'll actually take the content that you've put inside your elements and then move it outside of it in the DOM, which probably isn't what you intended to do with your page there. So Internet Explorer, it's got quite a nice easy fix for this. For some mysterious reason that no one knows, if you do this and actually document.createElement, magically when we go and refresh this page here, it will actually be styled correctly. There's certain scripts that will do this for you, and we'll go and iterate through all the different elements. Probably the most popular is Modernizer, which we're going to come back to, and a couple of other people have written some other scripts around this area. Be aware of this if you're starting to use these elements. You're going to need to cope with some of these other older versions of browsers that don't actually understand these. The other issue that you're going to get is that every browser has a default style sheet. It chooses whether certain elements are inline or block elements. And if it's an older version, it's not going to know some of these. So for example, by default, it's going to make your sections inline elements, which again is probably not what you wanted to do on the page and can lead to some issues. So I've described some of the issues up here. For these reasons, I actually think that semantic elements are probably a bit more of a pain than they're worth at the moment. Weigh it up though, and look at which your users are on your page. The next area I want to look at is some of the enhancements to forms. So let's jump into a demo here. And this is one of the sort of areas where the support for this across browsers really differs greatly. So I've got Chrome open here, and I'm going to go into my input type demo here. By the way, all these demos, they're all available now, and it's quite a nice hello world of the various areas we're going to be discussing today. So please feel free to download it. So I've got a number of new elements here. With date time, you can see it sort of displayed in this rather bizarre format, which isn't so user-friendly. We get a slider here. The color, we actually have a color type of input element. At the moment, it's only supported in Opera and bizarrely the BlackBerry internet browser. How useful that is, I'm not sure. In order to actually see what's capable of this type of thing, these display best, the support for these new types of elements is actually best in Opera. So I'm just going to load the Opera one up here. And we can see with date time, we get sort of inbuilt date controls. We can just shift through the time and stuff there. And it's quite nice in that we can avoid some of the sort of JavaScript-based UIs that you might be using at the moment in order to create this type of experience. There we get our nice color picker there. The other item that's been added is we have this sort of default text which you can use to help your users fill out their forms. So with telephone, maybe it says type your phone here or something like that. You click it, it goes away, enabling you to type it. If you don't enter anything, it's still there. Now it's obviously the type of thing that you could just add fairly easily within JavaScript, but I think it's very much easier in order to be able to specify that, and that's quite a nice feature. One of the other things we have is we can indicate that certain elements should be required on form submissions, and this is an area that's really not very well supported across the browsers. So at the moment I've told that if we look into the source here, I've said on the telephone, there we've got our placeholder text that the phone should be entered here, and I said this is a required field here, so that when I actually submit my form here, I'm going to go and submit this, we get automatically this experience from Opera that says, hey, you've actually got to go and fill this in. Maybe in the future you might be able to rely on this type of validation a bit more, but you of course should always validate your form entry server side as well. So it may give a slightly better experience to some of your users. But why might you actually want to use some of this? Because the support for this is quite varied, as you can see. It's not very good, the support for this in Internet Explorer, so Opera is the best that supports this at the moment. One reason you might want to use this is these are very well supported in iOS devices. You've probably seen as you're navigating around some pages on maybe your iPhone or iPad, you get a slightly different keypad. So for example, if you go to an email field, which is another type of input element, you'll get a keyboard optimized for email input. The great thing about these features is if the browser doesn't actually understand this type of input, it's just going to render a text box instead. So you're giving a better experience to the users that do have support for this type of thing, and your others aren't going to notice a difference at all. The other item I want to look at is drag and drop. This perhaps is one of the most ugly and horrible APIs that has ever been written for the web. There's various JavaScript libraries that are very good with enabling drag and drop support. There's an API built into HTML5 for working with this type of thing. In fact, it's so horrendous that I'm going to say at the moment, in pretty much 90% of scenarios, you don't actually want to make use of this. To demonstrate just what's actually involved in this one, I'm just going to bring up Firefox here, and I'll explain the reason why in just a sec. And I'm going to go into my drag and drop demo here, and I can pick up this rectangle here, and I can go and drag it into the other rectangle. If I look at the source of this page, you can see how ugly some of this code is. The reason I'm displaying this in Firefox is that for other browsers, I'd need to add a whole heap of other code in order to actually support this at the moment. So not only is it pretty unpleasant at the moment, I'd need to probably double that amount of code to get that supported across IE, Chrome, Safari, and the rest of them. So I really can't advise if your idea is you just want to be able to drag something around the page to use this at the moment. Now, I was going to write this API off completely, but it does actually have one quite good use, and one thing that's quite interesting to do. I'm going to open up a preview of Internet Explorer. Where do I put it? Let's load that up there. And let's drag that across. And by default, it's going to take me to the test site here. And it's quite a nice example here called Magnetic Poetry. Now, one of the things that the drag and drop API enables you to do is actually interact with the desktop on the application. So if I went into my presentation, let's grab an image, and let's go into, and I'm going to content and images. Of course, every good technical demo has a picture of a cat, and I can go and drag this on. And I can actually interact with this on my web page. Some of the other browsers will enable me to add various text content and go and drag that on. So you can see that we're actually starting to get a blur of what's a web application and what's a desktop application here. So this could be really quite a cool area, and to enable some other types of interaction with your web pages in the future. It's a bit dodgy, the support. It's very different across the browsers. So it's an area to watch at the moment, I'd say, rather than jump into. But in the future, I think this is going to be quite a cool thing. I'm just going to close that demo down there, and let's go back into a presentation there. So it's a couple of changes to the DOM API. This is by no means all of them. I just want to make you aware that what a lot of people do is they automatically reference jQuery in their applications. In some ways, that's a really cool thing. It's pretty much a sort of standard JavaScript library now. But what a lot of these people actually want to do is just select some elements on their page by class name. There's a couple of sort of alternatives or ways of doing this. One of the things that's actually introduced in the latest version of the DOM API is this get elements by class name. It works how you'd expect. Pass in a class name, you're going to get a collection of elements back. We also have some other extensions to the document in order that you can determine what's the active element on the document, what element has focus, and you can actually get the selection that the user's got. If you do just want to be able to transverse and manipulate elements on the page in a sort of manner similar to jQuery, please look into something called Sizzle, which is jQuery's selector engine, but it's much smaller than the full library if you don't need to do all the other stuff that's actually involved with it there. Let's look at some of the audio and visual sort of changes within the specification. So one of the issues with audio and visual is that in order to actually play any music or video, a file called a codec is needed in order to actually interpret the file format. One of the problems is that due to various, I guess, copyright issues and knob waving, no one could actually agree on one codec that should be supported. So we end up with this scenario where we now have this nice new element in order for playing video or playing audio, but there's no one codec that everyone's going to actually agree to use. Probably the nearest thing you're going to get to this is a codec from Google called WebM. This is supported by Chrome, Safari, Opera. It's supported in Internet Explorer if the codec's already installed. So what can we do with the audio and video elements, and why might you actually want to use them above a standard page? So I'm just going to close this one down here, and I'm going to go into my audio and visual demos. So I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit because I don't trust what's going on with that one there. And let's go into a very basic element
For
here.
years, Billy's been trying to
I've taken
customize his
a
web
video
browser.
here. I wanted something web-based. Here's a very old video about Firefox. There's a couple of ways to actually play this video.
After many fruitless
I've
trials,
added the video
Billy
element
almost
here.
gave up on his dream of a better browser.
I'm going to stop that,
Then he discovered
and we'll actually look at what was involved on sticking that on the page there. I've added the video tag there. We have this poster attribute here. This poster just indicates what's the image that should be displayed before the actual video starts playing. We then got a number of different options we can add. So we have this controls thing. We can say, you know, give this element some controls, play button, pause, all the sort of standard stuff here. We have autoplay. Should this actually start playing immediately as it's loaded? I'd encourage you not to do that. It's pretty irritating. A preload item here, whether the element should actually be preloaded as the page is actually loading up, and whether this loop, whether the content should just be looped, of course. So as we have this issue of various different codecs and no one actually agreeing on which one should be supported, what it enables you to do is within the video element you have these source elements here. So in this particular instance we've got the Ogg Vorbis version here. If you could also provide an alternate, another source version beneath that in maybe some MPEG or MOV or whatever you'd like to play it in, and the browser will automatically fall back if these items aren't available there. Why might you actually want to do this type of thing? Well, one reason is that it's actually part of the DOM on your page and you can manipulate it as such. This example here I've nicked from Mozilla's site and hacked it together. But I'll start playing this video here, and you can see that we can actually manipulate this on the page. So I can apply various filters and effects here. I can actually perform CSS transformations on this. For all extensive purposes, it's another element on the page. There's a whole API for accessing and playing the various video and manipulating it. We can do some strange things here. It's quite a powerful sort of API there. So look at those examples there. To use the audio element, it's very similar. We've got a nice trombone sound here. In order to actually add this to your page, it's the audio here, and the source, and we've got similar sort of properties that we can say we want the controls for it, we want to autoplay, that kind of thing there. It's very easy to use. It's a miserable sound. So what I'd say at the moment is, because support for this is a little bit sketchy, is consider using some of these third-party components or sites. So there's some companies called like Sublime Video. We have the Open Standard Media Player, and these will provide a nice wrapper where they'll initially try and play your video or content using some of the HTML-based ways. And if they're not supported in your visitor's browser, they'll actually fall back to a Flash or Silverlight player. So this can actually take care of some of the complexity around this type of thing for you. Let's move on to Canvas. I think Canvas is probably the most well-known HTML5 sort of area. It's also probably one of the most sort of promoted and overrated. We'll come back to what's actually involved. For those of you that haven't worked much with Canvas, I'm going to go into my Canvas demo here just to demonstrate some of the sort of things that you can do with it. I can draw squares on it. I can draw lines on it. I can create arcs on it. I can curves. We can put fonts on it. We can put gradients. We can clear that. We can put images. We can draw bits of images. We can, in Canvas, we have this thing called the context, which is kind of like the paintbrush, I guess. I can rotate this, and then I can go and draw this, and we can perform some quite nice effects with this here. So one of the questions I had in the previous, when I gave this presentation previously, is, when should I actually use Canvas over SVG, which is another type of graphics technology, and they are quite different. So Canvas, it's called an immediate mode of drawing. When I write all this stuff to the screen, the browser has no memory of what I've done. So if I want to actually move anything about, if I was doing some animation, I need to redraw everything. Now there's a couple of ways around that, and you can redraw sort of individual bits of the page. But this actually makes it very good for certain types of tasks. So with Canvas, it's very much quicker than SVG if you are drawing a lot of stuff on the screen. So if you're programming a game or something, Canvas is probably the way to go if you need speed. SVG, on the other hand, it has a whole hierarchy, and it remembers where stuff is on the page. And so if you're sort of coming up with this idea of various diagrams you want to click on and manipulate, then you might be better off going with SVG for that type of thing there. So we get a couple of new sort of APIs and some quite nice things that we can do with Canvas. Of course, one of the things we can do with it is some very simple animation. I don't think we'll be killing what can be done with Silverlights and this type of thing. And in fact, this is probably one of my biggest issues with some of the Canvas stuff, is that in order to perform some really quite simple animations, it's a reasonable amount of code here. And we're actually just, on this particular example here, I'm just bouncing a rectangle up and down. And if we had a more complex animation, it's probably going to require me to have a fairly decent knowledge of various maths and stuff, which is certainly not my area. So how do we actually use Canvas? Well, there's a couple of parts to it. We have a Canvas element which I've added to the page. I've highlighted it in this example with this rectangle round here. It has a width and a height, sorry. And you can actually add some content there to be displayed if the browser doesn't support this particular feature. When you actually want to draw with the Canvas, you go and get the Canvas element, and then you go and get a context. And then there's various operations that you can go and perform on this there. So on my particular example, you'll see I'll go through some of the basic APIs and stuff that you can do with it. Although in these particular examples, they're very, very simple, there's a lot you can do with it. And there's some really cool examples. One of my favorites, I was just speaking to one of the delegates earlier, there's a very nice example on the IE site where it goes and flies you through the solar system, and it'll actually render this in the sort of 3D. There's a library called FreeJS, JS3, something like that, in order to perform these type of transformations with Canvas. And a lot of people have created some libraries and good stuff around some of this. Earlier versions of IE don't support Canvas. There's some workarounds that you can use with this at the moment. One of the ones I was looking at was Xcanvas there. Some versions of Opera, they're actually looking at adding 3D support using some of the Canvas, although probably the interest at the moment with 3D seems to be around WebGL at the moment. We have various versions of Wolfenstein there, and so there's some quite impressive things that you can do just with the Canvas element there. There's a really nice cheat sheet about how to access the various elements and APIs. I'd encourage you to take a look at this one. I think it's got some quite nice information there. The Canvas support is pretty good across the browsers. Apart from some earlier versions of IE, it's pretty good. So I think this is an area that you can make use of now. I think depending on what you're doing, if you're doing a game, it's quite a useful thing to do. But I'd actually encourage you to use SVG if you need to display very simple graphics and stuff. I think it's a better way to go. You can produce the content in something like Inkscape, which is a free program, which will go and actually produce all the SVG, and then you can add it to your page. Theoretically, in the future, it can be indexable by search engines, and you can actually manipulate it in the DOM itself. Let's talk about some of the offline stuff here. So one of the things we're seeing with some of the devices, and some of the offline stuff works quite well for some of the mobile devices, like some of the iPads and iPhones and that type of thing, is that people actually want to be able to use your application when they're not connected to the internet. And there's a couple of APIs and functionality that have been introduced around these in order to actually work with some of this better. One of the things this actually works with, surrounds this, is something called the cache manifest. And this is a file which actually lists all the files within your application that the browser should cache in order to be used offline. So it's got an agreed format. If I go into my project, and I'm just going to pull up the offline folder there. And if we look at a sample manifest file, this is the actual format that this looks at. So we have cache manifest at the top there, and then files to cache. And then we have this comment here. Now this comment here is really quite important, because if you make any changes to this cache manifest, the browser only knows to download a new version of these resources if you actually make a change to the file. So for example, if I change this CSS file here, it's not going to know to actually download the latest unless I modify the manifest file itself. And one of the suggested ways of doing this is just add a comment here with a bit of content in here. I had a demo which worked probably about a year ago, and what it did was when the application was actually offline, it would fall back to displaying an offline JPEG, whereas when it was online, you get this online JPEG. And this is what this fallback element is here. It says, if I'm online, display this resource here. If not, display this resource here. It's really quite finicky, I guess is the word. You need to be very careful that all your resources are available, otherwise none of them are actually cached offline. You need to make sure all the paths are correct. The other thing that happens is that when the page that's actually referencing this manifest, which I'll show you in a sec, that gets cached as well automatically. So in order to use the manifest, you'll create yourself a manifest file, and we'll go into offline here and manifest. I'm going to view the source. In your HTML element there, you just reference the manifest file you're going to be using, and then that'll be accessed. For those of you that are actually playing around with this on a Microsoft-based machine, you need to know about something called MIME types. I'm just going to load up IIS here. When it kicks in, where is it? And it's still loading up. Hopefully that will come up in a sec. But basically in IIS it has this concept of MIME type, where you describe certain files with a particular extension you need to serve in this particular way. And it lets the browser actually understand how to interpret them. So IIS has decided to wake up now. So by default, the manifest file won't be part of this. And indeed, if you're playing around with any of the audio-visual stuff and you have videos in OGG format, they're not included as defaults. You'll need to add these as well. In order to add these, if you just go into Google, type in what's the right MIME type for whatever the file it is that you're adding there, and then you go into this MIME types bit here, you click add, enter in your extension, so in this case .manifest, and it needs to be served with something like text manifest file there. You just add that, and then that should work as expected. So in IIS, you can see there I've added that particular one in there. And that. So the other sort of areas of offline is we have local and session storage. If you're actually storing something that you need to be maintained across pages. Maybe you store it on the server, and maybe you have some sort of common identifier. Maybe you store it in a cookie. HTML5 introduces a new API called local, and there's another one called session storage. These are much more, allow you to store much bigger items than cookies would. The size is dependent on the individual browser. So I think Safari allows you 2.5 meg, Chrome allows you to store 5 meg. The items that you're storing, they must be stored as text. In order to actually use it, it's very easy. We have this local storage here. I give it a key, and I give it the item that I actually want to store there. And I can go and retrieve my item in a similar fashion there. If you're working with this type of thing, you probably actually want to be working with this in Firefox or Chrome, in that their dev tools have a nice thing where you can actually see what's in some of the storage. And this goes for most of the offline stuff here. So I'm just going to bring that up a bit. I'm going to give it a key, TechEd, Alex, and we'll go and add that to the storage. I can go into this resources node here, and you'll see that I have this local and session storage properties in the DevTools down here. I can go and expand some of these, and I can actually go and see what's been stored in these particular elements there. And again, if we'd stored anything in the application cache, we could see what's going on there. The support for this is good across Firefox, Safari, Chrome. Yeah. There's another advantage this has over cookies. And one of the things you might have noticed with storing stuff in session or in cookies is it's actually shared across the tabs in a browser. Session storage, if you store something in there using this new API here, it is not shared across tabs. So if you do need to store anything, this is the way to go. I'd advise you, if you have found yourself in that situation, you're possibly doing something wrong. It's probably not the best way to write your applications, but just be aware it has got that particular advantage as well. Let's zoom out of that. And so we have APIs for adding, getting, deleting. We can enumerate through them, and we can clear all the individual values that are held in session there. One of the other very important APIs, in my opinion, that's been introduced is called the Browser History API. As we're sort of developing more sort of interactive applications, what we see a lot of is that you'll have a web page, it'll go make an AJAX request to the server, it'll go pull in a load of data, maybe you'll display something different in the page, maybe the user will click a button on this dynamically created element, maybe something else will happen. Now the problem for the user is that if they actually want to go back to the previous stage, if they click that back button, they're going to be taken off your page completely, which probably isn't behaving in the way that the user would actually like this to. So we have a nice new API for actually controlling some of the history in the browser. So I'm going to go into here, and if you notice at the top here, if I magnify onto this, I'm actually on page 3.html there. I'm going to click back there, and I'm going to page 2 and page 1. Now, none of these pages actually exist. They're just something that I've added with the browser history API there. And that's not the source of the one I want to use. And it's going to browse history. Ooh, Chrome can't deal with that. I shall show you over here. So history. HTML5 browser history. Expand this here, and I'm going to open up this page, and we can actually look at some of the code to enable some of this here. It's very easy to use. We have this history push states here, which enables us to actually push items onto the history of the browser here. We can also add a state object here. Perhaps we want to hold some other information, and then this can just give us a bit better control of the user's experience on the page. And I think you can sort of come up with scenarios where you can now make your pages sort of behave a bit more how the user might expect, rather than, if you click back, you're going to a completely different page here. And this is just a sort of a way of giving you control of some of this. One of the things other people like to do is they like to use these hashbang, which is it's basically, you can add like a sort of an element, a history element within the page, and you have the hash character. You can jump to it. Some people like to use some of that because it's search engine indexable. I think this sort of overlaps with some of that functionality, although some of the hash bangs have the sort of nice characteristic that they're, search engine indexable, and it'll go straight away to the items. Let's go back through our history there, and let's go back to the presentation there. So with the offline applications, we talked about the cache manifest there. We're going to list all the files we want to be available offline. This is really quite cool for some of the mobile browsers in particular. We talked about how to manipulate some of the history and local and session storage there. The next item I want to delve into is microdata and data, which have been added. Now, these are two very different but sort of connected concepts. We have a need, or some people would suggest we have a need, in order to actually be able to share information on our page to other devices or other programs. We want the ability to be able to actually give meaning to our page, or perhaps come up with some sort of structure or vocabulary around that. And that's really what microdata is concerned with. So a simple example that I've got here, I'm going to come into this, close these windows down. Let's come across here. I have a very simple page here using the new microdata format here. We declare a web page which actually describes our vocabulary. It's just a standard web page. It's just a reference that other people can look at. So there's this site called data-vocabulary that's maintained by Google, and that actually describes a syntax here. So we have this item prop here. That's describing the various elements. We have the title, role, maybe the nickname for the person, their website, and you can actually nest these vocabularies here. And it's quite a sort of nice way of actually giving meaning to some of the elements on your page. At the moment, we've got some of these sort of agreed upon formats where elements, you need to describe elements in certain order. So some of you may have used the HCal format, or I forget what the other one is. But this is perhaps a bit more descriptive and easier to use. So microdata is about sharing with other applications and devices. Now sometimes there's the need on your page to actually add a bit of data that you're going to use yourself. And this is really where the data attribute comes in here. So I've got a div here, and what data is, it's for describing basically meta information that you're going to need to use on your page. So for example, on this div, I've added my organisation there that I work for, and that gives a bit of information there. We can then actually work with this here. So for example, if I want to get the value of this, I can do get attribute there in a standard sort of way that's going to be supported in very old browsers. JavaScript, of course, allows you to just add in pretty much any sort of any attribute that you might want to on any element, and it's still going to cope with it. Data is like an agreed upon format for doing this type of thing. And you'll find that some of the things like jQuery actually have this built in now. Chrome and Safari allow you to work with this API in this type of format here by accessing the dataset property. jQuery allows me to query data properties of this element in this type of format here. So I think that's quite a nice way if you need to add in some additional information about your page there. So there's a number of technologies which aren't strictly HTML5, but they tend to get lumped in with them. Probably the major one is geolocation. It never was HTML5. It's its own specification. Please look into it. It's some nice APIs. It's very much browser dependent. It's supported across different browsers, but it's very easy to use API to work around with that. WebWork is basically, you can think of it as a sort of threading model for JavaScript. JavaScript really only has sort of one thread that it runs on. So if you've got some work which is going to take quite a long time, you can actually make your UI quite unresponsive by processing it in a traditional manner. So with web workers, it's very easy to use. I've got a page here. I'm going to create a new worker, and in order to do that, I just reference my worker file, which in this instance is just called worker.js. I I then say, when I actually get a message from this worker file, what I'm going to be doing with it, and I can post various data to this worker using this API here. In my worker, I can actually handle some of this stuff here. So on message, we're going to do some stuff. So I'm just going to return a simple string in this example. What you might be able to imagine with this is you can perform some quite sort of lengthy work without actually looking up the UI. Now, workers can spawn other workers, although this is the support for this is a little bit sketchy across some of the browsers. So in that example there, that's just posting the message and manipulating the string that's passed in there. It's very easy to use, and I'd encourage you to look at this area. We have something called offline SQL databases. This is a pretty horrendous idea, actually. I should have removed this one here, but just to give you sort of an example of things that you really shouldn't be doing. Someone thought it'd be quite nice if you could work with data in a sort of a manner similar to a SQL database on the web. And this is the API they actually came up for using some of this. I think you can imagine there's some probably fairly horrendous sort of encoding issues. It's not very easy to use. This has pretty much been dropped now. It is, I believe, still supported in Safari, but I wouldn't touch it. It's a horrible idea. What they're suggesting they're using is something called indexed database. I'm not familiar with it. I haven't used it, so I can't tell you much about it. But that's the preferred direction of going rather than this type of thing here. But I leave it in there for historical reasons, or perhaps show you something horrible there. We have WebSockets. Now, WebSockets was sort of running along very successfully until probably about 3 or 4 months ago. The idea behind it is that it's very much more efficient way of communication than posting HTTP requests. It's actually it maintains the connection. However, someone found a security issue with it involving proxy servers, so they kind of went back to the drawing board on some of this. So at the moment, I would stay away from WebSockets. I think that's going to change in the future, and there's not really many nice sort of libraries and APIs around it. We have something called the File API, working with the contents of the file. I don't know too much about it. I'm not going to talk about it. So all of these features, you've seen I've skipped around some of the browsers in order to actually show you some of my examples. Now, most of my examples are very, very simple. They're hello world. They're as simple as I could possibly make them. And the issue is that because of this lack of support, you're going to have a bit of a job on your hands in order to actually make sure that the majority of your users can actually work for your site. Now, I think I've actually put this sort of slide in probably about 2 or 3 of the last presentations I've done. Progressive enhancement, it's a philosophy, a way of designing your pages. And it basically says, take the most simple client that you want to support and make sure your page works for them. And then build up on top of that by detecting functionality in order to provide the best experience possible to your more capable or your users which are using a more modern browser. The alternative to this was a philosophy called graceful degradation. The idea behind this is that developers, they go and use the sort of newest, shiniest APIs. They detect where things weren't supported, and then they'd go and put in various sort of hacks and features and ways around this. The reality was that this didn't actually work so well. I think a couple of reasons for this. I think possibly developers forgot and didn't get everything right. And I suspect also projects ran out of time and people thought, oh, it doesn't work in IE 7 or whatever, who cares? And it just got filed as a bug later on. So when you're working with all of these types of items, all these new APIs and elements, you've got a couple of options. You can check if various properties exist. So geolocation, it's not an HTML5 thing. We could check the object, whether it exists. We can try and create the actual element and call a method on it. But what I encourage you to do is use a library, something like Modernizer, which makes this very much easier. Modernizer gives us a nice API. I can do if modernizer.audio in order to actually determine whether the browser supports the audio element there. The other great thing about Modernizer is it's got quite a nice sort of way of providing sort of fill-ins or polyfills scripts. So I've got my example here. If I support Canvas, it's going to display an alert box. Otherwise, I'm going to say, no, you don't have Canvas, you suck. But one of the nice things about Modernizer is we've got this loading, sort of conditional loading API here. So we can say, in our test, we want to see if you support geolocation. If you do, go and load geo.js, which maybe contains the latest way of doing things. Or if you don't, go and use this polyfill to provide some sort of wrapper or alternative functionality here. And I think this is quite a nice way of working with these APIs and providing support for them. So what's the support like across the browsers? Well, it really varies. Probably the best supported at the moment is IE10, which I was playing with last night. There's a site called html5test.com. A lot of people argue about how sort of accurate the results of this are, but what this site does is it sort of gives you a score as to a very arbitrary score as to how well these features are supported in the browser you're currently viewing it in. And that's some of the results that you're seeing here. It gives you a rough idea as to the level of support there. One of the things you should note is that previous versions of the Windows Phone are running IE 7.5. I believe the Mango update upgrades this to IE 9 or IE 10. So you're going to find the mobile optimized website experience is going to get a lot better for those particular devices come that update there. One site I'd encourage you to use is this caniuse.com. You can type in a particular feature and it'll give you a nice indication as to how well it's actually supported across the browser. And it's really quite nice to see, you can look at your user stats and you can see, what's going on with them there. So perhaps if we want to look at Canvas there, we type in Canvas there, and then we can see what the support is like across the browsers there, and then the sort of individual and related APIs there. So that's a pretty useful site, I think. So what features should you actually go about using? Well, if you follow these philosophies of progressive enhancement, there's no reason you can't use pretty much all of them, but it's going to require a bit more work on your part. I was at a presentation recently, and one of the guys stood up and he said, we don't support IE6 anymore, and he was quite proud about this fact. I've seen some of the visitor stats of some very large Australian websites, and from my point of view, he was saying, screw 10% of my customers. As much as you may not want to actually support IE6, it's still very important. So you really need to be designing your applications around this philosophy, detecting whether these features are supported, providing that experience for the users that can cope with this, for those that can't, just falling back to something else there. What don't I think you should use? Possibly a little bit controversial. I'm not sure the semantic elements are actually worth their hassle at the moment. You may disagree with me. You need to include a script to get that styling in previous versions of IE. At the moment, they're not well supported across the devices for disabled users, and you're better off with ARIA roles if you need to work with that type of area. I do believe it's an important area for the future and it's the type of thing we should be doing, but for me, I think it's more hassle than it's actually worth at the moment. There's a number of new elements. The support's a little bit varied across the browsers. There's a progress bar. I believe it's only supported in Opera and Chrome. I'd stay away from that type of thing. I've mentioned the drag and drop API. Please have a look at this for yourself. You'll see just how horrendous it is, and you'll probably go running back to your jQuery draggables fairly quickly. It's a much better way of doing this type of thing if you just need to be able to shift elements around the page. Audio and visual. I'm of two minds about this. As long as you provide fallback video type of content, I think you perhaps want to look at some of the third-party solutions around this that are going to take care of some of the complexity of this for you. The other interesting sort of item with audio and visual is there's this sort of experimental support for subtitles at the moment. If you go to a guy called Bruce Lawson's site, I believe I referenced it at the end of my presentation, he's got some quite nice examples where he sort of adds subtitles to a video there. So, I don't know, I'm not sure about audio visual. I've got a question mark against that one. Stuff I do think that you can use straight away, I'd encourage you to use the doc type. You'll find Google use that on their home page. Use the new input types and attributes. If they're not supported, the browser's just going to go about ignoring them. There's a feature called cross-document messaging, which we didn't look at, but it's actually about components within pages communicating between one another. So if you go download my example code, you'll see how you can get a page communicating with a separate widget and passing in information. I think that could be quite useful on your site. Canvas, it's very well supported. Sort of sketchy supporting IE8 onwards, but pretty much every modern browser now supports Canvas. So I think you can fairly safely make use of this. Microdata and data. Data in particular, it's not going to do any harm. You can call your elements whatever you like, but this is sort of an agreed upon format for metadata information with your page. I would encourage you to use that. Microdata, these sort of format wars are always continuing, but I think this is an interesting area. I believe that Browser History API, and that's very well supported across previous versions of browsers, is a pretty good thing to be using. Geolocation SVG, again, support's pretty good for these now, so please look into these. Offline support, I'd be a bit careful with at the moment. I mentioned earlier I had a demo. This broke in 6 months with sort of browser changes. It seems to be an area that's really undergoing some changes at the moment. You're quite safe using things like the local and session storage, but be careful with the cache manifest at the moment. Some browsers have also had some bugs, so the previous version of Firefox, I think, wouldn't let go of the previous version of the manifest. So this could create some complications for you and some quite annoying and hard to debug issues. So I'd be a bit cautious about using some of these areas. Okay, so I think we can consider all these features. HTML5 is a big whole set of features that we might want to make use of. Some people consider HTML5 perhaps more like that at the moment, a set of ingredients that's a little bit unfinished and not ready. But I think what we can do is we can take the individual features and we can actually enhance our site and make use of a lot of this now if we're careful in the way we code our sites. If you want to learn more about this area, these are 2 books I'd recommend. I have this HTML5 one here if anyone wants to flick through this one. They're very good and they're very easy to read for a quick introduction of pretty much the majority of the specification. In order to get the most up-to-date information on HTML5, you're of course going to need to refer to the actual specification, and you'll find it's a very fluid thing and it changes very frequently, although I think a majority of areas are starting to get locked down now. Thank you very much.